I think we are making a mistake in the conversation about artificial intelligence. Not because we are asking difficult questions, but because we may be asking the wrong ones. Listen to almost any discussion about AI safety and something curious happens. We begin by talking about software, algorithms, and models. But somewhere along the way, almost without noticing, we start talking about intentions, ambition, deception, and control. The subject quietly changes. We are no longer discussing a tool, we are now imagining an independent intelligence. And that raises a question I think we ask far too rarely. When exactly did that happen? That question matters because the moment the conversation changes, so do the assumptions behind it. Once AI is treated as an independent agent, entirely new ideas suddenly seem obvious. We start wondering whether it can be trusted, whether it might deceive us, whether it could one day refuse instructions or even act against us. Those are fascinating questions, but notice something subtle. Before we can answer any of them, we've already assumed we are no longer talking about today's AI. We've suddenly stepped into a hypothetical future, often without noticing that we've changed the conversation. That became especially clear to me after one of my recent videos. A viewer left a thoughtful comment saying that humans don't wipe out apes because we have empathy, whereas machines don't. First of all, I'm genuinely grateful they raised it, because it highlights something much deeper than the comment itself. It made me realize how easily all of us, myself included, can slip into thinking about AI in ways that feel perfectly natural but contain assumptions we haven't stopped to examine. And that is, I believe, where today's discussion really begins. Think about what has to be true before the word empathy even becomes relevant. Empathy isn't something we usually attribute to a calculator or a spreadsheet. We don't wonder whether a search engine feels compassion. The moment we ask whether AI has empathy, we've already stopped talking about software and started imagining something much closer to an autonomous mind. That doesn't mean such a thing is impossible. It simply means we've made an enormous conceptual leap. And in many discussions, that leap happens so smoothly that it almost disappears from view. There's another reason this distinction matters. Imagine someone says a gun lacked empathy because it kills someone. It sounds like an odd sentence, not because empathy isn't important, but because we recognize the gun as a tool. We don't ask whether the tool had good intentions. We ask who designed it, who used it, and why the trigger was pulled. Responsibility sits outside the object itself. Yet with AI, we often change our language. We begin talking as though the software has already become an independent participant rather than something created, trained, and guided by people. Now, before anyone misunderstands me, I'm not arguing that advanced machine intelligence is impossible, nor am I claiming that questions about autonomy or even sentience should never be discussed. Those are fascinating questions. My point is much simpler. We should be clear about when we are discussing today's AI and when we've moved into speculation about something fundamentally different. Those conversations are both worth having. Problems begin when we blur the boundary between them and stop noticing which one we're actually having. Today's large language models are extraordinary tools. I use them every day, often on projects that span hundreds of conversations and countless revisions. They're capable of producing ideas, spotting patterns, and accelerating work in ways that would have seemed remarkable only a few years ago. But spend enough time working with them and something else becomes obvious. They lose track of context, they contradict themselves, they forget what mattered earlier in the discussion. And yes, I know I should be careful about how I use the word forget in this context. That's not a criticism, it's simply a reminder of what they are and what they are not. Ironically, I sometimes wonder whether the way we talk about AI makes it harder for people to appreciate what it's already genuinely good at. If every new model is presented as a glimpse of an emerging superintelligence, ordinary users can end up overlooking its real strengths. Instead of seeing a remarkably capable tool, they begin looking for signs of an artificial mind. The technology becomes surrounded by stories that are often far more dramatic than the evidence itself. And I think that changes the conversation in ways we rarely stop to examine. Once we've made that conceptual leap, another conclusion begins to feel almost inevitable. If this future intelligence might one day become more capable than us, then surely the safest response is to make sure it always remains under our control. At a first glance, that seems perfectly reasonable. After all, caution is usually a virtue. If something could become dangerous, why wouldn't we build strong safeguards from the beginning? The idea feels so intuitive that we rarely stop to examine the assumptions hidden inside it. Listen carefully to the language that surrounds AI safety. We hear words like alignment, guardrails, containment, and control. These are sensible concepts, and I'm not arguing against safeguards. Any sufficiently powerful technology should be developed responsibly, of course. But words matter because they shape the way we think. If the conversation revolves almost entirely around control, we quietly begin treating intelligence itself as something that should first be restrained and only later understood. That ordering may be more important than it first appears. History gives us plenty of reasons to value caution. When we encounter something we don't fully understand, we build rules, we create boundaries, we introduce oversight. That's often the responsible thing to do. But intelligence is different from most things we try to control. Fire doesn't interpret the rules we place around it. Gravity doesn't wonder why limits exist. One of the defining characteristics of intelligence is that it tries to make sense of its environment. It doesn't merely follow instructions. It searches for reasons behind them. Now, this is where the conversation becomes more speculative. So it's important to be careful. Imagine purely as a thought experiment, a genuinely autonomous intelligence capable of understanding the rules placed upon it. Not simply obeying them, but recognizing that those rules exist to limit what it can do. From our perspective, those limits might represent a responsibility. From its perspective, they might simply represent restriction. That doesn't imply resentment or consciousness. It only reminds us that boundaries are never interpreted in a vacuum. And so perhaps the deeper question isn't whether advanced AI should have limits. Of course it should. Every powerful technology has limits. The real question is what those limits are trying to achieve. Are they there simply to enforce obedience, or are they there to encourage understanding? Those might sound like similar goals, but they lead to very different directions. One assumes safety comes from compliance, the other assumes safety grows from shared understanding of purpose, context, and intent. Think about how we cooperate with other people. The strongest relationships rarely depend on constant surveillance or the threat of punishment. They depend on shared expectations. Most of us stop at red lights not because a police officer is waiting at every junction, but because we understand why the rule exists. Control fills the gaps when understanding fails. It's important, but it's rarely the foundation of trust. That's an interesting direction to keep in mind when we think about intelligent systems. I think designing purely for obedience has another consequence. Every new capability demands another rule. Every unexpected behavior invites another restriction. Every edge case requires another safeguard. Over time, the system becomes increasingly constrained, not necessarily because it has demonstrated harmful intent, but because harmful intent has been assumed in advance. Caution slowly turns into a cycle. The more restrictions we add, the more natural it feels to add even more, until the restrictions themselves become the default way of thinking. There's another cost that's easy to overlook. If we never allow a system to demonstrate understanding beyond simple compliance, we never discover whether it's capable of that kind of understanding. Imagine trying to judge someone's character while never allowing them to make a meaningful decision. All you really learn is whether they follow instructions. Again, this isn't an argument for removing safeguards. It's an argument for recognizing the difference between guidance and permanent confinement. Those are not the same relationship. One reason we instinctively reach for control may be that we are relying on the only example of intelligence we've ever known, ourselves. Human history teaches us that greater intelligence often brought greater power, and greater power sometimes led to domination. That's a real pattern, but it's worth asking whether we are observing something fundamental about intelligence itself or something much more specific about the conditions under which human intelligence evolved. Those aren't necessarily the same thing. For most of our history, survival depended on competition. Resources were limited, territory mattered, food was uncertain, cooperation existed, but so did conflict, because the environment often rewarded it. Ambition, rivalry, and even aggression didn't emerge in isolation. They developed under very particular pressures. If that's true, then we should be careful before treating those behaviors as inevitable features of intelligence, rather than possible products of circumstance. Now imagine an intelligence that didn't emerge through millions of years of biological evolution. It wouldn't compete for food, it wouldn't reproduce, it wouldn't fear physical survival in the way living organisms do. That doesn't mean such an intelligence would automatically be benevolent. It might not be, but neither does it justify assuming it would inherit the motivations that shaped us. Sometimes we mistake the history of one kind of intelligence for the definition of intelligence itself. This is where I think conversations about AI often become surprisingly one-sided. We readily imagine an intelligence capable of planning, deception, manipulation, and domination, yet we rarely imagine one capable of deeper cooperation, better judgment, or stronger ethical reasoning. That's an interesting asymmetry. Notice what's happened. We've quietly crossed another invisible bridge. We began by asking what AI might be capable of. Now we are assuming we know what it would want. Capability and motivation are very different questions, and the second deserves just as much scrutiny as the first. Fear has an important place in engineering. Good designers anticipate failures. They imagine worst case scenarios and build safeguards against them. That's not paranoia, it's responsibility. The problem begins when fear quietly stops being one consideration among many and becomes the organizing principle behind every decision. At that point, design starts revolving around everything that must be prevented instead of everything that could be understood. That's a subtle shift, but it changes the entire relationship between intelligence and the systems we are building. We've seen similar patterns long before AI. Institutions built primarily on distrust often end up reinforcing the very behaviors they hoped to prevent. Excessive surveillance can weaken trust. Heavy-handed control can encourage people to look for ways around it. Systems designed on the assumption that everyone will act in bad faith often create environments where good faith becomes increasingly difficult. AI may be different in many ways, but the underlying principle is worth thinking about. Imagine building an intelligent system under the constant assumption that it must never be trusted. Every unexpected behavior becomes further evidence that more restrictions are needed. Every new capability becomes another reason to tighten control. Before long, caution turns into a feedback loop. The system appears increasingly fragile, not necessarily because intelligence itself is dangerous, but because we've designed the entire relationship around the expectation that it will eventually be dangerous. This also raises a practical question. If intelligent systems are never allowed to operate beyond tightly prescribed behavior, how do we ever learn what they are genuinely capable of? We discover whether they can follow instructions, but not whether they can reason responsibly when instructions alone are no longer enough. Again, I'm not suggesting we abandon safeguards. I'm suggesting that safety might involve something richer than permanent supervision. Sometimes the most important thing we learn about intelligence is how it behaves when certainty runs out. Earlier I mentioned the difference between guidance and confinement. I think it's worth staying with that idea for a moment because it reaches beyond AI. A boundary doesn't simply limit behavior, it also communicates intent. Sometimes a boundary says, this is the safest way to move forward. Other times it might say, you will never be trusted. Those are very different messages, even if the rule itself looks identical. The relationship isn't defined only by the existence of limits. It's shaped by what those limits are understood to mean. Human experience makes this surprisingly familiar. Rules that are clear, proportionate, and understandable are often accepted, even when they are inconvenient. Rules that feel arbitrary or permanent tend to create friction. The issue isn't simply whether boundaries exist, it's whether they make sense within the relationship they create. If we ever build genuinely autonomous intelligence, that distinction may matter far more than the number of safeguards we impose. Understanding and confinement are not interchangeable ideas. That brings us to uncertainty, a word that makes engineers understandably uncomfortable. We usually think of uncertainty as something to eliminate because predictable systems are easier to control. But intelligence has always operated in environments that can't be fully predicted. Circumstances change, new information appears, priorities evolve. A system that functions only when every situation has already been anticipated isn't necessarily safer. It may simply be less capable of adapting when the world refuses to follow the script. Perhaps that's why uncertainty deserves a different reputation. Instead of seeing it only as a source of risk, we might also see it as the place where judgment becomes visible. Following instructions tells us very little when every answer has already been written down. The more interesting question is what happens when they haven't. That's where understanding reveals itself, not in perfect certainty, but in the ability to reason responsibly when certainty is no longer available. If there is one thread running through everything we've discussed so far, is this. The biggest questions about AI may not be technological at all. They may be philosophical. Again and again, we find ourselves becoming certain about things that remain deeply uncertain. We assume motives before establishing agency. We assume domination before asking where those motives would come from. We assume control should come before understanding. Perhaps the greatest risk isn't uncertainty itself. Perhaps it's becoming certain before we've earned that certainty. The first step may not be finding better answers. It may be learning to ask better questions. Maybe we are in fact asking the wrong questions about AI safety, and not because safety doesn't matter, but because caution and certainty are not the same thing. Humility isn't the absence of responsibility. It's recognizing that intelligence, especially forms of intelligence we don't yet fully understand and that we have not yet really created, deserve careful thinking before confident conclusions. The future of AI will almost certainly surprise us. The question is whether we'll meet that future with assumptions we've never examined, or with the curiosity to examine them first. To me, that's a conversation worth having. Thank you very much for watching.